thank you so much for coming. Like I said, this is Jaden's event. Each of our royalty gets to have a platform event, and we're just super excited that Dr. Indigenous Clark is here to talk to us today. She's coming all the way from the University of Indiana. So, without further ado, Jaden Breakwaters.
Like she said, my name is Jaden Breakwaters. I'm this year's Mr. American Indian OSU. I'm Ponca, Kiowa, Creek, and Choctaw, and my chosen platform is the importance of Indigenous philosophies. And I changed it from the importance of Indigenous philosophy, singular, to the importance of Indigenous philosophies, plural, after reading some work by Dr. Sullivan Clark. And I'd like to recognize two people in the room, my grandpa, Dr. Pete Koser, right there in the Eagles hat, and my sister, Dr. Savannah Waters. They helped me come up with this platform after many conversations with them, just listening to them talk, and it's a very important one to me. And so, joining us today is Dr. Sullivan Clark. She's a member of the Wind Clan of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. She's a first-generation university student. She earned her BA in philosophy from Oklahoma State University and her MA and PhD from the University of Washington. Formerly a President's Indigenous Peoples Scholar in the Philosophy Department of the University of Windsor, she currently holds a joint appointment in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine and the Native American Indigenous Studies program at Indiana University. Her research focuses on social epistemology, particularly group dynamics in knowledge-producing communities such as scientific research teams and indigenous societies. She also investigates indigenous and non-indigenous concepts of allyship, the role of land acknowledgement statements in reconciliation efforts, and indigenous responses to epistemic oppression. Dr. Sullivan Clark is the editor of Ways of Being in the World and Introduction to Indigenous Philosophies of Turtle Island. And without further ado, Dr. Sullivan Clark.
Hello, how are you? Yeah, so I am, like Jaden said, a social epistemologist. And so I'm really interested in how groups generate knowledge, and that's not just scientists, but also indigenous communities. And so today my presentation is called Stories We Live By. And so I'm talking about how indigenous people generate knowledge and contribute to their way of being in the world. And how that is important for not just indigenous people, but non-indigenous people as well. So first, to get started, there are some respectful beginnings that we need to do. First things first, Henshe estonko, Dr. Sullivan Clark, chahoheketos hokulkokit, maskagi momis. So I'm just welcoming you and telling you that I am from the Wind Clan of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. I am on the path to reclaiming my culture and my language. So I hope if there's any Muskogee speakers out there that I didn't butcher it too much, but I am a student of this and I'm learning it, but I insist on having the language spoken in institutions of higher learning, because for so long we were not allowed to speak our language, and our language was absent from these halls of learning. And so for me, that's a very important thing. I also need to tell you that I'm not an elder and I'm not a knowledge keeper. So what I'm going to be doing is approaching this as a philosopher who's indigenous. And so there's going to be some things that I need to tell you. First off, one of the things is that the materials I will be using, I have permission to use, and they are used in a scholarly fashion and most likely not how the communities themselves would use their stories and their philosophies. But like I said, I'm looking at this as an academic, and I feel like a lot of the work that I've done early on is to establish that indigenous worldviews are philosophy in the same way that ancient Greek philosophy is a philosophy. I also need to talk about the word indigenous as I'm using it. I'm restricting my claims to Turtle Island, so North America, Mexico, the US, and Canada. realizing that there are global Indigenous communities out there, but I do not want to speak for them. I want them to have their ability to speak for themselves. So I recognize their autonomy and sovereignty. So I want to use Indigenous as sort of a collective term, recognizing that, wow, there's over 1,200 communities in North America, just in Canada and the US. I don't know how they're counted in Mexico, but if there's that many, then it's very difficult to find a term that you could use to apply to all of them. So the use of Indigenous really means for those who are sharing the same philosophical worldviews. Now, if you don't know what that means, that's okay, because I'm going to cover that for you. But it's just, I want you to know that I'm not speaking for everyone. It's a very dangerous thing when we start speaking for everyone. Another thing is koja keleda helidos, and that just means that learning is a good thing. It's a phrase in my community, and it shows you that we value learning, and this coming together is such a unique and special thing. I'm so grateful that Jaden reached out to me to be able to do this, because I learn as much from my audiences as they learn from me, and the exchange of information. Come on, I'm a social epistemologist. It's a good thing, right? The next thing is when we are on the historic lands of Indigenous communities, one of the protocols is to oftentimes acknowledge that land and acknowledge the people who were here before us. And that's really important in cases where you have a land grant institution like Oklahoma State, because that means that that land was somehow taken to be used for educational purposes. And so we need to think about the privilege and the benefits that we have because other tribes or communities gave up some of their land rights, whatever. I want you to be aware of that. And so I want to say, a thank you and a recognition to the Osage, the Quapaw, the Kickapoo, and the Kiowa, who were the original inhabitants. But then I also want to say, acknowledge the contributions of the 39 tribes in Oklahoma, of which, my tribe, my tribal town is in Alabama. And so we were removed in the middle of the 1800s to Oklahoma. And so I want to, instead of just acknowledging the land and saying a few names of tribes, what I would like you to do is, if you haven't had the chance, I'd like to invite you to read some of the work by these authors. Joy Harjo, Cynthia Lateach Smith. You have at your fingertips, right? Being at a location of higher learning, you have access to these thinkers. And so that, out of the 39 tribes that reside in Oklahoma or call Oklahoma home, there are many that put forth wonderful works for you to explore. And so that is sort of the way in which I like to do a land acknowledgement, is not just to acknowledge past contributions, but to acknowledge where they are right now. So please, I invite you to take a look at those. Let's see. So I thought I'd give you an outline of what I'm going to do. The picture is of the 4 medicines. And so what I'm going to do is, hopefully by the end of my talk, we'll be looking at the strategies or the ways in which we can find healing between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So I'm looking for something like what they talk about in Canada called reconciliation, knowing that that's a long ways off, but there's a lot of work and that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So in my outline, I'm going to talk about philosophy because I don't assume that everyone has taken a philosophy class or know what philosophy is. So I talk about Western philosophy, especially that from ancient Greece, because that's where we think of philosophy is coming from. And then I'm going to talk about indigenous philosophy. Remember how I said that some of my first works have been trying to establish that indigenous philosophy is philosophy. And so I'm going to show you the way that it is. There's going to be some differences, of course, and I think that's fine. And vive la différence, right? There's going to be some challenges in stating that there is an indigenous philosophy, and I'm going to take a look at some of them, but not all of them. And then I'm going to talk about being a good Muskogee and what exactly that means. So I'll be using a story from my community. I'm going to point out how it's philosophical so that you can get a feel for what I talk about when I say that it's a way of being in the world for us. And then I'm going to talk about how it relates to knowing, because I'm a social epistemologist, and I would like to claim that having indigenous philosophy is good, not just for indigenous communities, but non-indigenous communities as well. And so it's something that we should promote, and it's something that we should protect. Okay. All right. So first off, philosophy, Western philosophy. Well, it comes from ancient Greece. Usually Socrates, so that's who the picture is of, and he's usually seen as the poster child, beginning with Plato. Socrates never wrote any philosophy himself, but we find a lot about him in the works of Plato. Philosophy in the ancient Greeks, in the ancient Greek language means love of wisdom. And so everything about philosophy is going to be at getting at the truth and becoming wise. So that's why you see things like the thinker, you know, Rodin's thinker, or you see the pictures of the ancient Greece, like he's thinking very deep thoughts. And so part of that is that love of wisdom requires some contemplation on our part to get at the truth, to get at how the way the world really is. There's different ways of describing Western philosophy. So you might think of it as a method, and this comes from Aristotle, another ancient Greek. He talks about argumentation. In fact, he comes up with different accounts of, in different forms of arguments. So it's not argument in the sense that you think of fighting back and forth. And it's not really like in debate where you oftentimes have competitions against each other and someone's declared a winner. It looks a lot like debate, but it's not quite that competitive, because what we think of as philosophy is that everyone's trying to get at the truth. And so it's more of a cooperative enterprise, although if you look at our behavior, it doesn't really always look that way, just to give you a heads up. But it's oftentimes, if I wanted to persuade you of something, then I'm going to give you good reasons for why I think you should believe whatever I'm trying to get you on board with. If you agree on those reasons and we can find we can determine that those reasons are true, then most people will be persuaded by the conclusion. Right? So that's the method. So if I were going to do an argument, just like a moral argument for it is wrong to treat people as means and not as ends in themselves, or treat them as objects, right? Then that's immoral. So what I would have to do is I would have to give you good reasons for buying that in. And if we can get on the same page, agree that our reasons are true, then you should buy that claim, right? Other ones might be something like a scientist. A lot of the journal articles in scientific journals are about experiments, and the scientists are actually trying to establish their findings are true. So they'll tell you about how they did the research and what types of sample sizes and where they got their funding. And so there'll be a list of all the different types of things that would lead you to believe that that experiment is that the results of the experiment is true. And so then you might have something like, oh gosh, let's think about the nature of reality. Is time real or is it a construct? Right? And so philosophers in the in the history of philosophy have given arguments for what time actually is, right? And so we often think that if you buy the truth of those reasons, then you should also agree to the conclusion. So that's one way, method. Another way is content. And this one gets a little bit more challenging, but this is where I see Indigenous philosophy as meeting the description. So if we have content, there are three ways in which you can have content in philosophy. One is the study of metaphysics, which is just the nature of reality. I know it's a big word, and sometimes we get a little snobby with our big words, but all it means is what's really real. What things out there are real? Is time real? Are numbers real? What about colors? Are angels real? Right? The movie The Matrix, right, has you taking either the red pill or the blue pill, depending on whether you want to be in a computer simulation, which is like the real world, but not. So it's very metaphysical. Right? Okay, the second area is epistemology, and that's where I sit. I do a lot of work on what counts as knowledge, right? So when we're talking about scientists, because they have experiments and because they're observable and we can reproduce them and they're transparent with them, then we oftentimes think that those are standards for a special type of knowledge, scientific knowledge. And so we often think of scientists as being cognitive authorities because they participate in a practice that has standards that are really high. And so we're more likely to believe what a scientist claims as opposed to, I don't know, a television personality or something with respect to a scientific issue. And like I said, I'm a social epistemologist, so I'm not just interested in how individuals reason, but I'm interested in how groups reason as well. Okay, so we've got reality, we've got knowledge, and then the last one is value theory. And value theory is the moral right and wrong. It can also be accounts of what's beautiful and not beautiful, or what types of laws. So issues of justice would actually fall into that area as well. So a lot of times the political philosophy, philosophy of law, philosophy of art are found in values. So it's not just moral right and wrong, but a lot of times we think of it as that. Okay? So those are the three big areas: reality, knowledge, and values. Okay. The very last way to describe philosophy is as an attitude. And they call it a critical attitude, but it's not negative, but it's just, you don't want to accept everything at face value. You want to be able to question and think about things when people tell you stuff, right? You don't want to just believe it right off the bat. You might look for supporting evidence or reasons to believe what they have to say, which would be running in the background. So anytime someone tells you something, you should ask yourself, are they being sincere? Are they an expert? Do they know what the words mean that they used? Those types of things, right? And those are things that we often don't even think about when we're listening to other people. So hopefully you're thinking about, my credibility about, philosophy when you're hearing this talk, right? And you don't just take everything I say as truth or as fact. You actually are a little bit critical. And Socrates said that, the good life and virtues are something that everyone should be thinking about critically every day. It's good for your soul, was pretty much his take on it. And I think that it's a good thing for you because you don't want to just believe everything that you hear. You want to be able to make up your own mind, and you want to just not fall for everything. So you avoid being gullible, and you also exercise your sovereignty or your autonomy by critically thinking, right? And so those are the three ways in which we think of Western philosophy. Now, sometimes they can use these as gatekeeping sorts of things because any other field or discipline that's out there that doesn't look like these might not be thought of as philosophical. And so that's the issue that I oftentimes have to butt up against whenever I'm giving talks. So Vlad Deloria was one of the first writers on philosophy. Now, he wasn't like a philosopher by trade. He was actually into law, but he wrote such big books for what we needed for Indigenous experience. So his Custer Died for Your Sins was actually something that inspired the Red Power movement. So those have, so his works, Power and Place, and Custer, those have actually had a motivating force in indigenous philosophical thought, right? And so he says that there must be indigenous philosophy, that it has to go beyond just being proud of a tradition that we have. And so I agree with him fully. I want to show you now how that's so. So where do we find indigenous philosophy? It's going to be community specific. Like I said, when I use indigenous, that means there's some communities that share the features, but not all of them will. But we'll work with the similarities that we have to kind of flesh out what we take to be an account of indigenous philosophy. Where are you going to find them? Well, you're going to find them in the stories and the oral histories and the narratives. And of course, cultural practice is going to reinforce these. And so you'll have just being a Muskogee, like myself, is going to be being a philosopher, right? And so challenges for this is that, well, we have the Western philosophical tradition that has generally thought of philosophy as being a particular method with particular subjects and a critical attitude, right? And so sometimes other philosophies have not looked like Western philosophy. So Chinese philosophy for one, Latin philosophy for another, feminist philosophy. I could keep going on, but those philosophies didn't necessarily look like Western from the ancient Greek and from ancient Greece, and so they weren't thought of as being philosophical. Okay. We also have problems with colonialism and assimilation, and that's because of the loss of our languages, the loss of our cultures, and the loss of our stories. So sometimes we say that our stories are sleeping and that they'll wake up when they're needed. But you know, colonialism had an impact on that, and we have to recognize that. The other is interpretation and epistemic justice. And so I'm going to go ahead and that one's a little bit more involved. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the three challenges and just explain them a little bit more in detail. So the philosophical views of Native Americans and First Nations weren't necessarily seen as philosophical because in Western philosophy, Indigenous people were portrayed as being in a state of nature, or being too primitive or too savage in order to be capable of abstract thinking, in order to be capable of doing arguments, right? And so you have this sort of works by philosophers like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, whose theories were not only used to establish that we could take land from the inhabitants of the New World because they weren't working the land in the right way. But they were also in a state of nature. So you actually have that first sort of hurdle there to try and get over to establish that, hey, just because they didn't write their worldviews down, you know, does not necessarily mean that they were too primitive or were not capable of abstract thought. Many societies were capable of quite advanced sort of thinking with respect to government, with also respect to engineering. So you have people in Agua Verde who lived on the side of a cliff. And so to be able to build into that cliff and have those cliff dwellings, as well as others having the Cahokia Mountain site in Missouri, or advanced sort of ways of conducting water to end agricultural practices. And so they were capable of these types of things. It's just that the mindset of Western philosophers did not think so. Others were that they expected them to come up with arguments, and that's not necessarily the way you're going to see the philosophy of Indigenous people who are relying on stories. So it could be an exchange between people, but it may also just be a story, which I think of as logical space for people to consider actions. And so, yeah, it's not going to look like it. If that's a standard of the discipline, then it's not going to meet that standard. And also there's a focus on the individual. So a lot of philosophy is done individually. People put forth their theories, and the whole argumentation process seems to be a going back and forth or a dialectic between two people. And you don't necessarily have that in Indigenous communities where you have groups that are reasoning. Now, that standard's kind of lightened up a little bit, especially with the advent of social epistemology, but social epistemology is relatively recent. You'd probably think it was old because it's from the 90s, but for me, that's relatively recent with respect to how long philosophy's been going on. The other challenge that we had, like I said, was colonialism and assimilation. Not being able to speak the language, not being able to practice the culture, prevents the knowledge from being passed on. And so today we may have people or communities that are struggling to identify their worldviews because of the damage that has been done. Fortunately, there have been cases where things have been kept and knowledge has been preserved, even at great cost to individuals. But I would like people to think about that as a player in like breaking connections to knowledge. Even something like removing my community from Alabama to Oklahoma changes the relations that we have with the plants and the locations in a way that our knowledge base, which was Alabama, Oklahoma doesn't look quite like that. And so there's going to be a resilience there, or an adoption of new relations and new ways. But the body of knowledge needs to be accumulated over time. And so there's not as much with respect to the local plants and things, unless they were also in Alabama, right? So thinking about those sorts of things, and how that impacts it, makes it difficult to think of Indigenous communities and their stories, if they get passed on, as being philosophical. The other one, the interpretation and epistemic justice, I say, who knows? It's not necessarily who knows, as I have no idea. It's who actually is a knower, who's seen as a knower. So earlier when I said that Indigenous people and communities were often thought of as too primitive or too savage to be capable of abstract thought, we could oppress Indigenous communities by thinking that they're incapable. So that's an epistemic oppression. It's preventing them from being seen as knowers just by the membership in a social identity or a community. And so when we have anthropologists and missionaries going out and collecting the history of Indigenous people early on, they are doing that through a filter, a Western societal filter. So sometimes the stuff that gets put into print is not necessarily going to be accurately representative of the Indigenous communities that they're taking a look at. So an example that I often use in class is the term sacred. A lot of people would take that on the religious sort of perspective, the Western Christian sort of perspective, when sacred in the in some indigenous communities often seems to be more of not fully religious, but also part of the creation of knowledge and that participation in culture in a location. And so it has a fuller meaning that if you're only looking at it in one way, wouldn't be fully captured on the page. I also have a few books of anthropologists who have gone down to collect stories. The one I'm going to give you about the Muskogee people. And, in their notes, they'll say, this doesn't seem like it's a Muskogee story. And actually, I think there was a Yuchi who lived, in the neighborhood. So it's probably a Yuchi story. And I was like, why are you saying, if they said that this was a Muskogee story, then I think that first person testimony and who's an expert, right? Probably trumps the I don't know, the science in that case, right? And so we have to be really careful about reading about our culture, reading some of the works and things that have been preserved, because they're always going to come to us in a filter, and they won't be necessarily pure. I don't know how else to say that. You also have to think about who's an expert. A lot of times people think of anyone who has a PhD as an expert on something. And I can tell you right now, Socrates got it right. I know that I know nothing, in a sense. There's a humility to being an expert. And so you don't have to go to university in order to be a knowledge keeper or an elder of an indigenous community, and nor should we expect them to. But a lot of times we defer to PhDs. And I know this sounds kind of crazy. It's coming from a PhD, but we have to be really careful in ensuring that knowledge is not silenced by people because we make the assumption that they're not accredited in a particular way. And that's a Western sort of way when you think about it, right? So things like elders, right? So oftentimes Western knowledge has limits on who can know and who cannot know. So they might say only elders, but that's not necessarily how it fits the community, right? The community might actually be able to have the knowledge. It just depends on what the knowledge is about, right? What the subject matter is. Ancestors, right? Ancestors speak to us and we speak to them. And so that would not be within the Western sort of epistemological frame, right? Our relatives. So if we think about the animals and plants and geographical locations, bodies of water, those all have knowledge, and they convey those knowledges to us through, and oftentimes they are recorded, put into our stories. So we might have something like the three sisters who tell you how to plant corn and squash and beans together in the right way, so that both the indigenous community and the plants actually thrive from each other's taking care of each other. And so we have to be very careful. It's like the picture of the forest there. It's telling you something, right? Communities used the trees and the grasses and things to tell them when to migrate up and down, or when they needed to go back and take care of the crops that they had planted earlier in a more southern location. And so they talk to us, they tell us things. And so that would not necessarily be caught in a Western epistemological frame as well. All right, so now we get down to the meat of the stuff, being a good Muskogee. All right, so I'm not going to tell this really in story fashion. I'm not a storyteller, and I'm very bad at it, but I have to use stories. So I'm trying to figure out how I get to do this and do it well. I haven't gotten there yet. So long before people were on the earth was covered with water. And there was a group of animals that were floating on a raft of wood. and they had been floating for a very long time. And of course, they were restless and they wanted to get off and they wanted to eat. But they saw no land in sight. Birds flew to the 4 directions and found nothing. And so they decided to hold a council, and they appointed an owl as the head of the council. And they ultimately decided that it would be a good thing if some of the members would dive down into the water to see if they could find some land under the water. And so the first one to volunteer was Beaver. And Beaver, you know, they're good swimmers, and dove into the water and swam and swam. And it was just really too deep for Beaver to go. And so they come up to the surface, and then they said, I just couldn't do it. I didn't find anything. The next animal was Frog. Frog was selected. Frogs are good swimmers as well. And so Frog's swimming and they're going down and down and down. But then there's a gar in the water that sees Frog and thinks Frog looks pretty tasty. So Frog boogies up to the surface of the water, right? And gets out and says, I'm sorry, I just couldn't do it. I wasn't able to find any land. And so the council turned to Crawfish. And Crawfish says, well, I'm ready. I can go. And it turned out Crawfish dives into the water and is actually a really good swimmer, better than Beaver. And so they're able to go down really, really low. And when they pass Garfish on the way down, Gar looks at a Crawfish and is like, I'm not eating that, right? So he's not hungry. He doesn't want that. So he's able to get down and actually finds land. And I don't know if you've ever seen a crawfish, but they have this sort of like fan tail at the back. And so Crawfish swims around, and builds up a mound of dirt. I've heard of it called a chimney. Chimneys make you think there's something coming out of there. So, but we'll get to that some other time. But builds it, and gets up to the surface with this big sort of column of dirt. And the animals are like, oh my gosh, this is great, right? They look at it and it's so wonderful. And thank you so much, Crawfish. But it's very flat, right? Now, so what they did was they got the buzzards to fly above them, and the buzzards flapped their wings in different ways, and they made the elevations, right? They made mountain ranges and hills and all sorts of things. And then it was perfect, just the way that it was. And so they get off the raft and they all go in their own directions to live their lives. Now, I never mention anything about humans. How is this going to tell you how to be a good Muskogee? Well, it's really important to realize that, like the Haudenosaunee or the Anishinaabe and Skywoman, that humans are the later people to show up, the later ones to show up to the party, right? To the big event. And so because we are the last ones to come, the harmony of the universe, the harmony of the world has already been established. And so anything that we do takes from that harmony or introduces some disharmony or introduces some chaos. Okay? So when we have stories, we can think of this story as actually getting us to think about living a good life. Now, stories, at least a lot of the ones that I've seen, are really only segments of a really long story. So we're only getting part of it. I couldn't tell you the whole story in the time that we have together tonight. But with just this section, we can see that it meets the philosophical subjects. Remember when I said the philosophical content, the what's real, what do we know, and how are we going to act? It tells you what's real. The animals, the shapes of the earth, the water, the relationship that they have. If you talk about knowledge, well, Beaver knows how to swim, but Buzzard's probably not going to. And Buzzards know how to fly, So there are knowledges there, and each one of them are going to have their own special knowledges for that's appropriate to them, right? What about values? So usually when I do this in a class, I usually have them read a story, and then I have them actually go find the philosophy. And because we can't have this like back and forth, I've decided to sort of present it to you. So I ask, what about the values? What are the things that they value? Well, being free to live your own life, right? That's what the animals do after they're done. Um, they believe in helping. They believe in being grateful. And so all these types of things that aren't explicitly stated in the story create this logical space for someone who's hearing the story to think about how they should act. Because if this is the story, and this is like the precursor story to how we come into the world, if this is the precursor, then it's going to tell us how and what we need to do in order to be a good Muskogee person. It's not solely ethical, and it's not going to give you should always act in this way, act for the benefit of the majority, or you should never treat people as means, always as ends. It's not like Western ethics in the sense that there's some theory or there's some laws and you have to behave according to those. This story actually gives you sort of a space for you to think about how you should act, for you to try on different sorts of reactions and responses, to think about how they might respond back to your actions. And so one of the things that comes out of it is something, number 3, Etimyaske Epokat, and I know I'm probably butchering that, but it means to live together well, recognizing that whenever you eat, whenever you live, whatever you wear, is placing a burden on the world in some way, is disrupting the perfect harmony that was set up before we were introduced into the world. You have to be cognizant of that. Then you also have to, because that harmony is a good thing, you need to promote it. You need to take care of it. You need to preserve it. And so there are right actions for you to do. Maybe not specifically that we can create a law or a rule or something like that, but there are things that you should do in order to restore that harmony or address any disharmony that you have introduced. Now, sometimes people talk about it as being something reciprocal. And I want to caution you that's a good way of thinking about it, right? They've done so much for us. We'll be grateful and do back for them. But it seems like we make it to where it's all about if they are useful to us, then we will take care of them. And that's not the way it is, right? Just because we need them for survival, we don't selfishly take care of them because it benefits us. There's actually a compassion, a respect, and a love. And the love is not a romantic love, but a compassionate love, so that you will them, you wish for them, you will act for them to thrive, to flourish. And that's what it means to be a good Muskogee person. Now, when are you doing wrong? Well, you're doing wrong if you don't think about that harmony, if you don't contribute to when you're making moccasins, using all the moose hides so that there's no waste, right? You're not wanting to disrespect, to take your tobacco bundles, right, and to place them in the water with a prayer for the water. It's sort of an awareness of your privilege, which, if you think about it, that's really what I want you to do with land acknowledgement statements. Think about how you were privileged. And I had to do this myself when I was working in Canada as an Indigenous person, because that was not my ancestral homeland. I needed to realize I was benefiting from a system that had taken advantage of the original inhabitants. And so that is what needs to be done here, is to recognize when we introduce disharmony. And so when you introduce that chaos and disharmony, it might sometimes be intended, right? You might do something willful, spiteful, whatever. It might also be unintended. And just because it's unintended doesn't mean that you get off blame free. It means that you still need to restore the balance. So doing the right things, like asking the plants whether it's a good time to harvest them, waiting until the green corn is in before you can think about eating corn. These types of things are important, and they help maintain that harmony and that love relation. So when we're talking about metaphysics and what's really real, there's one that none of my students ever tell me, and that's relationship, because they don't see that one in a Western worldview. We have relations. We have older than, younger than, front of, back of, the types of relations of how things are with respect to each other, but we don't have the relation in the same way that Indigenous communities have in the way of being in the world. And for me, that one's highly abstract. That one's definitely philosophy. And if you have relation, then it tells you what you need to know to keep that relation good. And if you're doing that, then you're being good. So it's all three: metaphysics, epistemology, and values braided together. I know I'm using a pun, braided together, one braid of philosophy. And that for me is what Indigenous philosophy is. Now, why is it important, right? So what? We're being Muskogee and we're knowing, why does it matter to anybody else? Well, this is the medicine sweetgrass. So why should we attend to it? And here's my argument on the page with the cedar on it. If the goal is to gain knowledge about the natural world, if that's what we want to do, if we want to learn about the world we're living in, then it behooves everyone to consider alternative sources of knowledge. And the reason is because it may benefit you as someone who's been marginalized to be able to be socially justifiable, listening to someone and increasing the social justice in the world. That might be a good one. But the other one is, even if you're in the dominant segment of society and you are the knowers, right? So the Western philosophers, it actually behooves you to consider alternative views in order to prevent you from not just falling for anything, but also to keep you from being dogmatic, to test your theories and to test your choices. There could be alternative sources of knowledge that you don't have access to, which would give you new knowledges of the world. And there would also be potentials for collaborations with those who hold worldviews that are different from your own. And that is how I see us getting toward reconciliation, is a respectful relationship that way between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. That is actually where the money should be, right? And here's just some of the problems, right? So if you think about like the upper left, that's the three sisters, that's the corn, squash, and beans, and how planting them together actually puts nitrogen back into the soil. That's something that if you had paid attention, you wouldn't have had to learn all the other types of stuff, right? A sharing and a collaborating together. Another one would be the wildfires. It seems like Canada and the Pacific Northwest are always on fire in the summer, in the late summer, and burn practices that Indigenous people have used. They're actually forming collaborations now so that they can have prescribed burns in the right way, so that we don't have the wildfires and the fires getting out of control in the way that they have. The one on the bottom left is just water. Just thinking about water and how we need to have clean water. There are Indigenous communities in North America that do not have access to clean water, have not had access for 20 years, over 20 years. There are kids that have been born on a reserve in Canada that have never known the ability to turn on a tap and have clean water. Those are the types of problems that I think we could solve with these collaborations. So some will benefit non-Indigenous, some will benefit Indigenous communities, but we all benefit from working together. The last one, of course, in space, looking toward the future, I think Indigenous communities would have something to say about the colonization of space. As colonized people, we have firsthand experience, and so I think that we could offer some interesting perspectives with respect to our science program, which has just gotten, they just got the new team of astronauts this week for Artemis 2, and they'll be going to the moon next year around September, October. So these are all these sorts of along with being on the page for SAGE, right? So we've had 3 of the medicines. The 4th one is tobacco. And that's where I stop and I ask my questions, because I could keep you here all night, but I don't want to do that. I want you to be able to eat and have a little bit of fun too.
Do you have any questions? Lauren. A student is asking for the Yuchi story you had mentioned earlier.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. How did it differ from the Muskogee story you had heard?
Oh, okay. So the book that I had several of them by this anthropologist. And so he had gone to the communities way back when and had gone and collected these stories. And to me, I didn't notice really any major difference. They wanted to say that that whole section of the diving story was the Yuchi story. But that was the one that I was told when I was a kid. So that's the one that I was familiar with. And I'd always thought that it was a Muskogee story. Does that help?
The First American Museum has that as the Yuchi story as well. And I've heard that I've heard it interchanged with the water spider before. So I just didn't know. Just wanted to know.
Yeah, the one thing about it is, you know, if you're going into a community and you don't recognize them as a confederacy, so that was one thing about the Muskogee people, was that they were a confederacy, so you had different groups together. And whenever you have that, there's always that intermingling of culture and practices. And so I imagine that some of the stories could overlap. This story is very similar to the Sky Woman story for the Anishinaabe up in Canada. It is animals that are diving down. They just happen to put the soil on the back of a turtle, so now we've got Turtle Island, right? Yeah.
I'm both, so I just had to ask.
Any other questions? Okay, my grandpa's asking, what are your thoughts on the Casita Idola? Their story about the beginning of time, origins, the beginning of time.
Oh, the origins of the world?
The Casita
Okay.
people.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have a friend, his name is Brian Burkhart. He's at the University of Oklahoma. He is Cherokee, and he wrote this lovely article in which there's this difference between Western epistemology and Indigenous epistemology. In Western epistemology, more knowledge is better. The more you get, the better off you are. And Indigenous epistemology, sometimes more is not better, and more is not. There are times when you could ask a question that would introduce chaos or disharmony. However, I have to preface that with, if it's in another community, I'm not going to be the one that makes determinations about that. That's not my place. I know what stories I need to know in order to be a good Muskogee, and those are the things that I'm going to treat as metaphysically real. And so that's how I live my life. But it's up to other people to make their decisions, and up to other communities to make their decisions. And so I wouldn't be able to like be a referee on something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
What's your tribe?
What's your tribal town?
Oh, it's fish ponds. I can't say the Creek Muskogee name for it. You know, when you get those THLs, I'm not very good at saying it. It's like Tokoko or something like that.
Is that all? One more question.
When it comes to applying this type of philosophy, we're in a society that stands in probably almost nearly 100% in opposition to this philosophy. What would you say, or what kind of advice would you give to students who are moving forward in their lives and careers? What would you say to them to give them, kind of advice to move forward and not give up this kind of philosophy for their future?
I think what I would say is, our ancestors went through a lot, right? And so us going through a lot today is pretty much the same. And they retain their dignity and their nobility, and they are resilient. And so sticking to the culture, going back and maintaining the ties to the community, those are the things that are really important. It's like when you think of like an ear of corn, like that is community, and you're one kernel, and without that one kernel, we just don't have the community, right? It's just not as good. And so for me, I think what I would tell you is be strong, be brave, practice your language, listen to your stories. Those are the things that are going to stay with you because they have stayed for so long. They're the things that have made it through, and they're the things that'll see us through too. I know that's not super helpful, but it's hopeful.
Hello. I think that's about it for questions. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Sullivan Clark.
Yes, thank you. Have you eaten yet?
Sorry, you got some a round of applause. Sorry.
Oh,
What'd you say?
thank you so much. Are you going to eat now?
Yeah.
Good. Good. Thank you so much for having me. And you're always welcome to email me if you have any other questions or thoughts. I'd love to hear them.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.